Hey everybody, before we get started today, I am super excited to share with you something we've been working on. We are partnering with Paramount Pictures to give away digital copies of their new movie, Fat Man. Have you guys seen the trailer for this movie? It looks absolutely bonkers. This movie stars Mel Gibson as Santa Claus in what they're calling an outrageous action comedy. When a 12-year-old boy receives a lump of coal in his stocking, he hires a highly skilled assassin to kill Santa Claus. I gotta tell you, I have checked out the trailer for this movie. I can't wait to watch it. It looks like a ton of fun. It looks just insane. Walton Goggins is also in this movie. You might remember him from Django Unchained, one of my favorite parts in that movie, or in Tarantino's The Hateful Eight. I am absolutely on board to check out this movie. 'Tis the season to get even with this dark action comedy that keeps on giving. Buy or rent Fat Man today. And of course, if you'd like to enter our giveaway, you can find our giveaway post on our Instagram page @FilmWhiskey. Let's get to the show.
In 2010, director David Fincher and star Jesse Eisenberg gave the world an incisive drama about the inception of a social media juggernaut.
In 2020, an international favorite hits the U.S. shores for the first time.
The film is The Social Network.
The whiskey is Blanton's Gold.
And we'll review them both. This is
the Film and Whiskey Podcast. Welcome to the Film and Whiskey Podcast, where each week we review a classic movie and a glass of whiskey. I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And this week we are looking at David Fincher's 2010 film, The Social Network.
You know, I've already apologized in the Crimson to the ABHW, to Fuerza Latina, and to any women at Harvard who may have been insulted, as I take it that they were. As for any charges stemming from the breach of security, I believe I deserve some recognition from this board.
I'm sorry?
Yes.
I don't understand.
Which part?
Brad, I feel like this movie is kind of a big deal in the history of our podcast. And obviously we have been reviewing nothing but classics for 3 seasons now. But this is one of those few movies that's come out in the 21st century that I think keep generating more and more buzz the longer it ages. We're looking at it on its 10th anniversary. It's been a decade. I feel like we can objectively kind of analyze this movie better now. But I think over the last 10 years, this movie's reputation has just continued to soar. And in no small part because of what we've actually seen from Facebook over the last 10 years and how it has come to consume our lives. This movie, I feel like, can't really be separated from its subject matter. And I keep seeing, critics all over the place talking about, is this the most important movie of the new century? So I guess it's probably a good thing we're getting around to talking about it.
Well, the fascinating thing about this movie, Bob, is it'd be almost like if you wrote a biography about Clint Eastwood when he was 50. You know what I mean? The dude has gone on for almost another 50 years worth of movies and directing and writing and all these things. And so when you watch The Social Network, it's about events that happened 5 to 7 years before the movie was actually made. And so it really is fascinating to see this film in light of what Facebook has done from 2010 to 2020 in the real world. It really is a unique film in that aspect.
Yeah, Brad, I feel like there's only been a few movies with this level of exposure that have done that in movie history. You can look back to the 1970s and look at movies like All the President's Men, who were, reporting on how the Watergate story got broken just a few years after it happened. But I think the closest analogy we could make, Brad, is a movie that we just did a couple months ago on this podcast, and that would be Citizen Kane. And I think that's actually a really appropriate comparison because the themes of both of those movies, I think, are also very similar. I have more than one time seen this movie compared to Citizen Kane and talking about how it is the Citizen Kane of the 21st century in terms of the subject matter. A guy who amasses all the power he possibly can, pushing people away, getting back at people, but longing at the end of the day for deep human intimacy that he can never have. And I don't think that's an unfair comparison to make. I just don't know if I like comparing it to Citizen Kane in terms of its overall quality.
Well, I think I would agree with you, Bob. I think that The Social Network shines because it has Aaron Sorkin as a writer. And what he does in this movie is really impressive because he bookends the movie with comments about Mark Zuckerberg being an asshole. You know, at the start of the film, it's Erica Albright, his girlfriend, his sophomore year of college, saying, like, you know what, man, you're just an asshole. Like, you are the worst. And you can kind of see why she thinks that.
I am sorry you are not sufficiently impressed with my education.
I'm sorry I don't have a rowboat, so we're even.
I think we should just be friends.
I don't want friends.
I was just being polite. I have no intention of being friends with
I'm
you.
under some pressure right now from my OS class, and if we could just order some food, I think we should be...
Okay, you are probably going to be a very successful computer person. But you're going to go through life thinking that girls don't like you because you're a nerd. And I want you to know from the bottom of my heart that that won't be true. It'll be because you're an asshole.
And at the end of the film, you have a young lawyer played by Rashida Jones saying, you know, like, you're not an asshole. It just seems like you're trying really hard to be one.
Yeah.
He bookends the movie with this question, is Mark Zuckerberg an asshole? And if you watch the entire movie with that question in your mind, I think it really takes this movie to the next level because you see how Sorkin writes every scene around that question. And it's so focused of a movie that I can see why critics have fallen in love with this film.
Yeah, I think there's a ton of things to praise here. I think there's also some stuff to nitpick. This is one of those movies that I think as its reputation has grown, I've gone back to. I've probably seen this movie 10 times, I would say. And that's no small feat for a movie that's only 10 years old. But I think the more and more people seem to fall in love with this movie, the more I go back to it and wonder, like, does this really deserve to be held up as the movie of the 21st century? And so, Brad, I'm excited to kind of get into that and answer this question with you today. But the first question that I have for you is, had you seen this movie prior to watching it for our podcast?
I sure have, Bob.
All right. Now, how many times have you seen it now?
Just once. Well,
Okay.
Just once before the podcast. I think I had watched it at some point when I was in college, around 2011 or 12, most likely. And I remember the first time I saw it thinking like, oh, that was a pretty good movie. Like, I learned more about Facebook, I think, but maybe I didn't because it's, you know, Hollywood and you never know how real that actually is going to be. So I remember walking away the first time and being like, oh yeah, that was a fine movie. It was like 7.5, 8 out of 10, maybe.
All right. I think that's pretty acceptable. And Brad, now that you've seen it this time, I think you probably know the contours of the movie a little bit better, which means you can explain to our audience, maybe some of whom haven't seen this film, what the movie is about. And so it's time for our favorite segment, Planet Earth's favorite segment, Brad.
The galaxy's
That's right.
favorite segment.
Why limit it to Earth? This segment is called Brad Explains. It's where Brad breaks down the plot of the movie that he has just seen, often for the first time. That is not the case today. And so, Brad, we are expecting an absolute home run of an explanation. Can you break down the plot of the movie, The Social Network?
Facebook wasn't real, and then Mark Zuckerberg made it real.
Boom.
That's it. He made it. He did it. Oh, man. Now, The Social Network is about a young sophomore at Harvard University, and he creates this crazy cool thing called Facebook. He comes around to the idea in a roundabout kind of way when his girlfriend breaks up with him and he's writing a blog post about it, and his roommate brings up the idea of like making a website where you could say if a girl or a farm animal is hotter, and he gets rid of the farm animal part, but he actually creates a website called Face Smash where there's just literally two girls from Harvard and you decide which one is hotter. And it breaks the Harvard internet, which I can't imagine would be very hard back in 2003. But it destroys the internet servers, and he kind of becomes a big deal. And he's approached by the Winklevoss conglomerate, might be a good word for them. It's these twin brothers who are basically Terminator, and they're like rich and famous, and their dad is an investor in Wall Street. And they are trying to create the next big internet sensation. And they come up with an idea for a website where you're able to socially interact with friends at school. and you'd have pictures, and you can talk about if you're in a relationship and post on each other's walls and all sorts of things. And they approached Zuckerberg after his face.
Oh, wait, hold on. Can I interject one thing?
Yeah.
And the most important thing about their idea is that you have to have a harvard.edu email address.
That is very true, because it's exclusive.
Exactly.
You have to know they use that word like 19 times in like 2 seconds. It's very exclusive. And so it's this exclusive website where only the Harvard elite can socialize with one another online. They approached Zuckerberg about writing code for the website after his, smash hit girl comparison website. And he is like, yep, I'll do it. And then he goes off to his best friend, Eduardo, and is like, hey, Eduardo, like, we need to make this website and it's going to be awesome. And he pretty much makes what the Winklevoss twins had thought of without them. And he dodges them and is sending them emails back and forth saying that he's busy and he won't meet with them. And at this point in the movie, you start to realize that it's actually a flashback movie, and the present time is Zuckerberg in 2 separate lawsuits, one against his supposedly former best friend, Eduardo Saverin, and a separate lawsuit against the Winklevoss twins. And the entire movie is then told in a flashback sequence of different parts of Zuckerberg's life as he is creating Facebook. It's about how Zuckerberg slowly builds relationships in the tech world, most notably with Sean Parker, one of the co-creators of Napster, and how Sean helped launch Facebook from being a smaller term $1 million idea into a massive $1 billion idea. And so the movie explores how Zuckerberg slowly pushes certain people away from him, how he is antisocial, and it really revolves around this question of, is Mark Zuckerberg a person that can be liked? And you're not really sure where it ends at the end of the film. But by the time we get to the end of the film, Facebook has been created. He is out in California. They have a massive office space. Sean Parker is arrested. There's all sorts of crazy stuff happening, but it all comes down to this girl, Erica Albright, that had broken up with him at the start. He friend requests her, and you're left kind of wondering, like, was it all worth it?
Mm-hmm. Brad, excellent job, sir.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, and as you were talking, I was going to ask you this, and it's a completely leading question, but what do you see as the overall theme of this movie? Like, not just what was the movie about, but like, what do you think is the main point they're trying to get across with this film?
Man, I mean, I think you could go in on deeper levels that might not have been there in 2010. But in 2020, I look at this movie and I go, man, this movie is about how a person couldn't hold real life human relationships. Mm-hmm. And so he created a website so that he could fake those relationships.
Absolutely.
And I don't know if that's necessarily fair to Mark Zuckerberg. I will fully say, Haley and I watched this movie together, and when we were finished with it, we went on and watched a few different interviews of Zuckerberg in the media. He is similar. I think Jesse Eisenberg nailed a lot of his mannerisms and kind of the way he talked. But I feel like Eisenberg took it a little bit too far into making him an antisocial, unlikable.
Yeah. So
is that something that you picked up on?
Yeah. So I think this is a good place to have this conversation. I thought maybe we'd have it in the second half of the show, but one of the things that comes up for me, even before we get into like the nuts and bolts of the film itself, is kind of the ethics behind the making of this movie. Because, we've been talking about this a lot lately, Brad, with our musical biopics miniseries, and how it's weird to see biopics made about people while they're still alive. And not only are you getting a biopic, or, quote unquote, a biopic about a person that's still alive, like you said, it's coming out like 5 years after the events happened. And Sorkin and Fincher and company were all very careful to say that they purposely kind of fictionalized this account of Zuckerberg, that they took him as an archetype, that they used his story, but they made him purposely different than the real life person Zuckerberg. And that comes out in Jesse Eisenberg's performance. He's much more cold and calculated. He speaks much quicker. I mean, if you've ever watched Mark Zuckerberg, like when he was giving testimony to Congress, the man is like sweaty and nervous and can't string a sentence together. This is a very different Mark Zuckerberg, this fictional character we see, than the one in real life.
He's been Sorkinized.
Exactly. And it kind of does make me wonder, though, regardless of what we think of Mark Zuckerberg, and I have many thoughts and feelings on what he's created and what it's done to our society, is it fair to do this to a person, not only while they're still alive, but then to use them as an archetype and a jumping off point, using their name, using their likeness, and getting some details exactly right, but then also completely fictionalizing other things. And it brings me back to this kind of Citizen Kane question. Like, is there an ethics behind this, or a lack of ethics behind this, that we just don't talk about because the movie's so good?
Well, I think it comes down to the fact that story is often so much more powerful than cold, hard facts and reality. And so regardless of whether or not Zuckerberg is as he's portrayed in this movie, what people will remember about him aren't his interviews on, Good Morning America, or him in the Senate chambers being interviewed by senators. In the end, what they're going to remember is a powerful and captivating story written by Aaron Sorkin, directed by David Fincher, and acted by Jesse Eisenberg. And so I think that you can claim all you want, like, oh, just, hey guys, this is fictionalized. It's a representation of maybe some parts of Zuckerberg's personality, but not all of them. But in the end, Bob, I feel like biopics like this are so hard because people always want to believe what they see in the movies are true. And so when they see a movie that has some modicum of truth in it, they want to just assign all truth to it.
Well, and
I really think that's unfair.
It is unfair. So that part is unfair to the makers of the movie. But I also think it is unfair for the makers of the movie to try to have their cake and eat it too, where they say, like, no, this is not a biopic. We've purposely fictionalized this man's life to tell a different story. But also, we're going to use his name and try to convince you that this is what really happened. It seems like they wanted to craft a narrative where they made Zuckerberg either a tragic hero or a villain, however you want to portray, or however you want to interpret it. But then when they get called out on the lack of accuracy, they say, well, we never wanted to be accurate in the first place. It just kind of seems like they're trying to play both sides of it.
Well, and that's the thing. When I look at this, if this was a 100% fake movie that had just been made up, I think that this movie actually would come across better. This is an incredibly tight film that is just, the cinematography is great. I think that the story is told in a captivating and powerful manner, that if it was 100% fake about fake people and they just made it up, it would be one of the most captivating movies I've ever seen. But because I know for a fact that it's about a real human being, I spent the whole movie asking myself, I wonder if this is really how Mark Zuckerberg is or not.
Were you leading them on for 6 weeks?
No.
Then why didn't you raise any of these concerns before?
It's raining.
I'm sorry?
It just started raining.
Mr. Zuckerberg, do I have your full attention?
No.
Do you think I deserve it?
What?
Do you think I deserve your full attention?
I had to swear an oath before we began this deposition, and I don't want to perjure myself, so I have a legal obligation to say no.
Okay, no. You don't think I deserve your attention?
I think if your clients want to sit on my shoulders and call themselves tall, they have a right to give it a try, but there's no requirement that I enjoy sitting here listening to people lie. You have part of my attention. You have the minimum amount. The rest of my attention is back at the offices of Facebook, where my colleagues and I are doing things that no one in this room, including and especially your clients, are intellectually or creatively capable of doing. Did I adequately answer your condescending question?
And I think that detracted from the movie for me.
Well, and I think this is one of the things that is a pet peeve of mine with Aaron Sorkin in general. And I like Aaron Sorkin a lot, but I think that we have decided as a society to fall down at his feet and worship him as the god of screenwriting. And with Sorkin, I think it's not just that it's hit or miss. It's that you have to be all in on it because Sorkin writes how Sorkin writes. And so it either works for you or it doesn't. And I think that in this movie in particular, I really am impressed with some of what he does. Like, that opening scene is always called out for being like, I don't know how many pages of dialogue that's uninterrupted and ending with that incredible line about it's because you're an asshole. But Brad, I was actually watching an interview with Aaron Sorkin where he talked about this movie in particular. And he said that the Facebook of it all, the Zuckerberg of it all, is incidental. That what he was interested in, he read the story of how Facebook was created and he saw in it a more universal story, right? This Citizen Kane kind of story. And he essentially said this movie could have been about somebody who just invented a really cool new toaster and it would have played exactly the same. And that really pissed me off to hear him say that, because Aaron Sorkin is too smart to try to play dumb like that. This movie is 100% reliant on audience recognition of what Facebook is, and also his own recognition of what Facebook is. Like, if you don't have the layer of the story of he made a social networking site, he made a site where other people go to meet each other and go to have connections with each other because he was looked over by all the final clubs that he wanted to get into, and B, it was the only place where he could create that environment for himself. I think with this movie, what Sorkin is trying to do, like I said before, is have his cake and eat it too. He wants to convince us that there's a more universal story being told here, but he's also like hyper aware of the irony of a very antisocial guy being responsible for humanity's social interaction now. Like, and I feel like what pisses me off about listening to Sorkin talk about this movie is that he tries to have it both ways, and it's very obvious that he can't.
Right. I mean, if you made a movie about how people made toast together, nobody would watch it.
Well, I mean, there's a really great movie that came out a few years ago called The Founder. I don't know if you've seen it, Brad. It had Michael Keaton in it, playing Ray Kroc, the guy that took McDonald's and made it into the empire that it was today. And it's very similar to this. But even then, like, the fact that it's McDonald's plays a huge role in it. Like, this guy changed how America viewed business ownership and diet and everything else. And so, like, you can't just divorce the subject from what they did. Like, it's essential to telling the story that Sorkin is trying to tell here.
Well, and that's the issue when you look at any sort of media adaptation of real events. I mean, heck, Bob, I look, I run a wedding business, and so I see wedding photos all the time. And some of these wedding photos are so heavily edited that I don't think that they actually represent reality and what was happening on that day. And sure, they look beautiful, but there's a part of me that goes, well, you're not getting the actual facts of really what happened. And so I think anytime you take the literal human existence and experience, and humans just can't create a true replica of reality that will ever replace reality. Like, we will never know about what actually happened between the Winklevoss twins and Zuckerberg. We'll never know actually what happened between Zuckerberg and Eduardo. Like, these things are just lost to history. And the crazy thing is, you can even have video camera footage of what happened and still not really get the full picture of what happened. And so I think this movie really does tie into the idea that everything is editorialized.
Yeah.
Everything has an opinion on it. And Sorkin, like you said, can't just act like, oh, this is just a story about an archetypal human character, a platonic ideal. Like, it's just not, you just can't have that.
Well, and that's the funny thing is, like, one of the themes of the movie is this idea of the truth lying somewhere in the middle. Like, you have conflicting accounts of the same thing in the movie. And then in the real life conversation about this movie, on the one hand, you have this idea that it's just a movie about how Facebook was made, which is false. And on the other hand, you have Aaron Sorkin, the guy who wrote the movie, saying Facebook isn't even essential to the story I was trying to tell, which is also completely false. You have to have both things kind of working in tandem.
Well, if there's anything that is essential to this podcast, Bob, it is, these movies we watch, but probably more important is the whiskey that we drink. And this Blanton's Gold is just too tempting to leave by the side any longer.
Yeah, Brad, let's get into drinking it. All right, so today we are checking out Blanton's Gold. Now, if you have been listening to the podcast for the last few weeks, you will remember that we first tried Blanton's Single Barrel a few weeks back. And again, everything comes with the caveat that when you are drinking single barrel whiskeys, there is a ton of variation that's possible. So the barrel that we got may be very different from whatever barrel of Blanton's you got your hands on. But Brad and I were not fans of Blanton's Single Barrel. And in particular, the sample that we got was the harshest Kentucky hug that we've ever had when drinking a bourbon. And so I reached out to the people that sent us that sample, which was our friends Bourbon and Stuff on Instagram. They also provided us with the sample of Blanton's Gold today. And when I asked them, like, hey, are you sure you didn't send us something different? They went back and tried that Blanton Single Barrel. They said, nope, you absolutely are spot on with your notes here. It's really harsh. But they promised us that the Blanton's Gold was going to be different. And so, Brad, I am looking forward to that experience at the very least.
Yeah, and Bob, this kind of comes back to a frustration that I have with single barrels, is that you just don't know what you're going to get other than the price. You know exactly what you're getting there.
Yep.
And if it's Blanton's, it's going to be, if you're lucky, $60. And otherwise, it's going to be $80, $100, $120 or more for this Blanton's. And so when you know you're going to pay that much for an uncertain drinking experience, that kind of knocks Blanton's down a peg in my mind.
Well, and that's the frustration that we continually have with Buffalo Trace products. They have become masters at allocating their products, at driving up demand, and then people having to chase it on the secondary market. And you quoted a $60 price tag for Blanton's Single Barrel. This Blanton's Gold is significantly more than that, Brad, and we'll get into that price here in a little bit. But just a little bit of quick background on Blanton's Gold. This used to be a product that was only sold overseas. It was kind of, I don't want to call it like a tourist trap, but it was something that, you know, travelers in airports in Japan would be on the lookout for because they'd want to pick a bottle up and bring it back to the States because it wasn't sold here. It's a really brilliant business model because only people who were traveling or who lived overseas could try this very specific brand of Blanton's. Buffalo Trace decided just this year to start releasing Blanton's Gold in the United States, again, after driving up demand like crazy because people couldn't get it. So it just dropped in the United States. It's only been available here for a few months. This is a 103 proof whiskey as opposed to the 93 proof regular single barrel. This is also a single barrel bourbon, so everything we say today comes with that caveat that what we're saying is true for the barrel in our glass, not necessarily the one in yours.
Yeah, and as I look at this whiskey, Bob, it's really got a beautiful color to it, a nice golden amber. It's got some nice legs. You can tell the viscosity is a little bit higher. And man, when I nose it, it is beautiful. There's some nice dried fruit notes on it. There's a little bit of classic vanilla and caramel. I am just really enjoying this on the nose, Bob.
Yeah, one thing that I will say, Brad, and I think we might diverge on the nose here a bit, this does remind me of the Blanton Single Barrel that we tried because it is very oak heavy on the nose for me. And that's something we pointed out the last time around. It does remind me kind of Eagle Rare in that regard, that the oak is really, really prominent and really, really heavy on this nose for me, kind of to the point where the alcohol and the oak are the two prominent notes for me. I do get a bit of that dried fruit, like you said, kind of undercutting it. But I think that the oak is so dominant on this that I don't know what this is going to translate to on the taste. So I'm only going to give it a 6 out of 10 on the nose.
Bob, I'm a little ways off from you. I'm at an 8 out of 10 on the nose. I think there's almost like a little hint of apple at the end of the nose. For me, the oakiness isn't overpowering. I don't know where that's coming from, but there's a little bit of oakiness there that's nice and smooth. To me, it's leading me to expect some pretty good things from the palate.
Well, Brad, let's give it a taste and find out what we think.
Huh. That's watery. Was yours watery?
I don't know if I'd call it watery. I'd call it milder than the last one we had.
That's an interesting palate. I'm not sure if my nose led me to the right places. There's a little more oak, like I think you might have been picking up, Bob. The viscosity isn't quite what I expected it to be. You know, being 103 proof, I expected a little bit of a thicker experience, and that's not quite there. But I am picking up some really nice fruit notes. It's a bright whiskey that has some stuff going on for it.
Yeah, I think what might be happening here, Brad, is that the taste is just kind of bringing us both back to center because you started to pick up the oak notes that were present on the nose. I actually, on the taste, started to pick up more of the fruit notes that you got on the nose. I think this is much, much sweeter than the Blanton single barrel that we had a few weeks ago, like much sweeter. This is a completely different whiskey. And I don't know if we just had a really wonky barrel or what, but this one is just all honey and fruit to me. It's much, much milder. There's not a ton of burn on it. In fact, there's this really interesting thing that's happening, Brad, when I took a sip of this, that it was almost like the taste skipped over a whole zone of my palate. It was really prominent on the front and in the mid, and it was honey and fruit, and then I went to swallow, and there was like nothing on the back of my tongue. There was no flavor left there at all. I could feel a bit of burn on the finish, and I don't want to get too far ahead, but I could feel a bit of burn there, and I had some flavors left over on like the front of my palate, but there was just nothing on one portion of my palate. It was really, really interesting. All that aside, I actually really enjoyed the taste on this, Brad, like a lot, and I'm super relieved that it doesn't taste like that last Blanton's we had. I'm going to give this an 8 on the taste.
I think I'm coming down a little bit from the nose. I'm going to give it a 7.5 on taste. Like you said, there's some really nice honey notes here. There's a little bit of that oakiness that you need, along with some of that nice fruit flavorings that give it some complexity. It's an impressive whiskey. I think I was just hoping for a little more out of it based off of the nose.
So I definitely gave this a Kentucky chew when I was drinking it. And that's where, if you've ever seen people who professionally taste bourbon, they literally like open their mouth, they make some obscene sounds as they're chewing on it, as you would like a piece of steak or something. And it introduces a lot of air into your mouth and actually, for me, really improved the tasting experience. I was swishing this around in my mouth pretty vigorously. The more that I drink this, the more that it reminds me of a couple other Buffalo Trace products that aren't from this mash bill. So I'll say that. But it reminds me of Eagle Rare in the way that the oak becomes prominent, but it also reminds me of Weller, especially Weller Special Reserve, in the way that it marries the oak taste with the sweetness. There's just like waves of oak that come through on this. So it's not overpowering. It really plays nicely with that sweetness. But I was really surprised at how much it reminded me of Weller Special Reserve. Not so much the antique, but definitely that green label reserve. I thought on the finish, Brad, that this is just a damn good bourbon. Like, it's really good. It's really solid. I don't think anything about it makes me want to run out and find a bottle, but because it reminds me of Weller, which I really, really love, and it's not a super harsh alcohol burn on the way down, I think I'll give it a 7.5 on the finish.
I think it's interesting that it reminds you of a wheated, Weller.
Yeah, it's not so much the wheat part of it. It's just like I said, it's just in the way that it marries the oak with the sweetness really well. And I think Weller definitely has those two notes as well for me.
Okay, yeah, I can see that. I think that it's got a really nice synergy between the sweetness and that oakiness, and there's a little bit of that fruitiness that goes on. I can see where you're coming from. For me, I think I'm going to stick at a 7.5 for the finish. There's nothing that's blown me away here, but it is a solid above average finish with a soft Kentucky hug. Coming off that last Blanton's, I was a little worried. This one is actually a little bit on the lower side of a Kentucky hug, and I'm kind of okay with that.
Yeah, I am too. And I think that it's a pretty well-balanced whiskey. Like, the nose kind of hinted at a little bit more alcohol than I thought we actually got delivered on the palate or the finish. But for 103 proof, Brad, this is very, very drinkable. And it's incredibly more drinkable than that last Blanton's that we had, which was only 93 proof. And so I'm sure that bad experience is definitely coloring my scores a bit here today. But I'm actually going to give this an 8.5 on balance. I think this is a very, very well-balanced bourbon.
Yeah, when it comes to my balance score, I think I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10. It's a very well-balanced bourbon, but nothing about it really thrusts it up to that upper echelon of a 9 or 10. Mm-hmm. So we're just going to keep it at an 8. Bob, I'm coming out on this whiskey to a point where I'm like, this is just a really solid whiskey.
Yeah.
But I'm worried about what you're going to tell me with the price.
Yeah, so here's the thing, guys. If you've listened to this podcast, you know that our fifth category is value. And so if you only are interested in our tasting notes and you only want to know what kind of score we'd give a whiskey on its drinking quality alone, just take our first 4 categories and multiply them out by 2.5 to get 100, right? So I'm at a 30 out of 40 on this. I think this is a really good upper echelon bourbon. Like it's a 75 out of 100 at this point, but we have to factor in value in our fifth category. And
I was going to say, I'm at a 31 out of 40.
Yeah,
so
we both really
we're
like
in the
this.
same spot. This is a really good whiskey.
But here's where the value comes into play, Brad. This is a annual release by Buffalo Trace. They're only going to drop this once a year, and they're going to drop it in extremely small amounts. So when I look at the Ohio Liquor website, it's not for sale anywhere right now because it's very allocated. And I know for a fact you're going to have to either stand in line for it or it's going to be a lottery pick somewhere. The state of Ohio, which regulates prices, so this is not secondary, sells this bottle for $120 a bottle. And this is where things start to get weird for me, Brad, because if they sold this at the price of regular Blantons, like if this was set at the price of Blantons, I would give it like an 8 or a 9 out of 10 on value. I think this is absolutely worth the $50 or $60. At $120, it is double the price that I would want to pay for it.
Wah, wah.
And if you just do a quick Google search of Blanton's Gold, the very first one that came up for me on Google Shopping was $699 because that's how insane the bourbon secondary market has gotten today.
Bob, that is so many dollars.
It's so many dollars, and it's not worth that. And in fact, it's not worth $120. This is a really good $60 bottle of whiskey, and $60 is nothing to sneeze at. That's like a higher end bourbon. And Brad, I'm going to give it a 2 out of 10 on value. I have nothing else to say about it. It's not a good value. It shouldn't be that high. I'm sick and tired of Buffalo Trace jacking up prices all the time. So it's a 2 out of 10.
Yeah, Bob, I'll just agree with you. 2 out of 10. There's nothing more to be said. Buffalo Trace, I mean, good on you for taking advantage of capitalism and people who love bourbon, but good night, bro. Like $120? Come on.
Yeah. And again, that's in a price-controlled state. So 90% of you listening to this are not going to get it for $120. You're going to get it for $200-$300, which would take my value score down even further. I'm coming out to a 32 out of 50. Brad, I believe that puts you out to a 33 out of 50.
It sure does.
So that's bringing our average out to a 65 out of 100. Like it's still a good bourbon, but that value score really kills this thing. I actually really, really enjoyed this until I saw how much it costs.
Yeah, Bob, I want to give such a huge shout out to Bourbon and Stuff for sending us this sample.
Gosh.
Because it genuinely is a great whiskey that I would be loath to send to anyone. So thank you so much for sending this out. But in the end, Buffalo Trace, get your stuff together, man. like I'm just really sick and tired of all these crazy expensive whiskeys that should cost anywhere from $20 to $50.
Well, Brad, let's just take this, burn and pillage attitude back into talking about The Social Network. What do you say?
Let's do it.
All right, so that was Blanton's Gold, a whiskey that we really, really liked, but we can't really recommend based on the price. And now we're getting back into talking about The Social Network. Brad, we went down the rabbit hole pretty far in the first half, and so we kind of have to backtrack and talk about a few basic things. We haven't talked about the performances. We haven't really touched on David Fincher's direction. I do want to go back to talking about Jesse Eisenberg because, you were making the comparison to the real-life Mark Zuckerberg. And I want to give him the benefit of the doubt and say that they purposely constructed this character to be different than Zuckerberg. And for what the character is supposed to be, a cold, calculating, antisocial college sophomore who wants recognition and who can't get it and kind of vindictively creates that recognition for himself, creates an environment where he can control who gets in and who stays out. I think Eisenberg actually does a great job in this movie. He was nominated for an Oscar. I think it was entirely well-deserved. It's a really great performance. I actually think just memorizing the sheer number of words he had to memorize was almost worth the Oscar nomination in and of itself.
Yeah, I was genuinely impressed with Eisenberg in this movie. And I'm going to frame it like this, Bob. I think that if you are willing to set aside the real life implications of this movie, that this movie is actually really, really great. And it's great because of its actors and its writing. And Eisenberg, this might be the height of his career. I don't think I've seen him in anything else that I really was like blown away by. But this movie was like the perfect peak of like needing Jesse Eisenberg to fill its main character role. He portrays Zuckerberg in such a way that you understand how he is both likable and hateable at the same time throughout the entire film. And so I really like Eisenberg in this movie. But the reason you understand how likable and hateable he is because of Andrew Garfield's performance as his best friend, Eduardo.
Yeah, Garfield's great in this movie, and there were a lot of people who were campaigning for him to get an Oscar nomination. He did not. I think he's really good here, Brad. I do think that 10 years of Andrew Garfield performances after this have kind of, I think, I'll say this. I think he's a really good actor, and I think maybe his best performance was in Scorsese's movie Silence, because it's the least like Spider-Man that he's ever been.
Dude, he's so good in Silence.
So good in Silence. And so that kind of leads me back to this movie where I'm like, okay, he's good, but I also kind of saw him lean into this a little bit in 2 Spider-Man movies after this. He's kind of just playing like the likable, sensitive, vulnerable Andrew Garfield part.
Yeah, he really is. He is likable, he's fun, he's interesting. And when, like, I think the reason Garfield is good in this movie is because when he is angry or upset, you feel it as an audience member. Mm-hmm. Like, you get why he is angry and frustrated because he's banging his head against this wall known as Mark Zuckerberg. And so I think that's where Garfield really shines, is when he's exasperated and frustrated. And the scene where his girlfriend is burning the gift that he gave her in the trash can, like, it's a little bit overindulgent, but there's still a part of me that's just like, I love that scene. It's so funny. It's a crowd pleaser, and I'm amused by it.
Well, speaking of crowd pleasers, I have to say, Justin Timberlake, I understand that Justin Timberlake
Bob, I don't want to like Justin Timberlake
but
in
I
any
do,
movie.
Right?
But I do.
And the thing is, Justin Timberlake, in real life, seems like a pretty good guy. I think he's really done a lot of image rehabilitation after dating Britney Spears and everything. But he leans into the douchebag so much in this movie, and he absolutely nails it. Like, he comes on screen, and we've used this phrase a lot in this podcast, he chews scenery. Like, he is there to just hold court, and everyone, especially Zuckerberg, kind of falls over and worships at his feet. And the whole time, Eduardo sees right through him. And the tragedy of the movie is that Eduardo ends up being right about Sean.
He picked up the check, he told Mark they'd talk again soon, and he was gone. But not before he made his biggest contribution to the company. Drop the just Facebook. It's cleaner.
But man, oh man, does Justin Timberlake just steal almost every scene he's in, or what?
The scene where they meet in New York and they're like ordering like tartar and all these different things, he's just eating it up. And so it's funny because you always talk about chewing scenery, and usually when a character chews scenery, it's almost like that's just what their character's supposed to do. But I feel like in this movie, it's almost like an Inception level of like a real life person who chews scenery being played by a character who is chewing scenery. Like, do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, it's just like layer upon layer like of a guy who is just over the top and ambitious and just knows that he is the center of attention because he wants to be the center of attention in any room that he goes into.
I mean, he is the ideal of what Zuckerberg wants to be in this movie. He is a guy who is, to sound like an old square, like he's sticking it to the man. He created Napster. failed spectacularly from a business point of view, but changed the industry by being like punk rock, basically. And by making something exclusive that he wanted to make. That's exactly what Zuckerberg's motivation is. And so when he sees this guy, Sean Parker, whose entire thing is disruption, disrupting the system, and being the guy who controls and pulls the strings, he becomes a puppet for him. And there's that great scene where, Sean's dropping him off for a business meeting and coaching him about how to say F you to the guy in the room, right? And he shows up in pajamas and everything else. And Zuckerberg just totally goes along with it because he is so enamored by this guy. I think anybody else in that role, and I really mean this, like, it's a role that I think a lot of actors could play, but casting Timberlake was such a brilliant touch because, like you said, Brad, he already is a sort of larger than life persona. He was in sync, for crying out loud. He dated Britney Spears, and bringing that baggage into the movie of what we already know of him outside the movie, I think actually really helped what that character was supposed to be in the film.
Well, and this kind of brings me to a point where I think that I am going to give Aaron Sorkin some advice. Because
I'm sure he'll take it, Brad.
I'm sure that he will. He probably listens to this podcast constantly. So here's the thing, Aaron. I think that this movie would have been better served if you gave Andrew Garfield a stable, steady girlfriend that at the end of the movie, instead of showing Eduardo with a girlfriend who is psychotic and jealous and burning, his apartment, that if they had finished the movie with him, like, in the bed talking to his wife or girlfriend and like being exasperated with his best friend, Mark, it would have served the movie so much better because the whole movie is about how Mark is desperate for human connection and human relationship. And that's epitomized by his inability to keep his girlfriend Erica at the start of the film. Yeah. So I think that it would have better served the movie's story if you showed how at the end of the film, Sean is arrested for doing coke off of an intern's belly and how he actually can't keep any relationship alive because of his dysfunction and because of his desire for prestige and honor and all these things. And if that had been contrasted with how Eduardo was the opposite.
Yeah. I actually think
make sense?
That's a great note. And, if we're going to give Sorkin notes on his script, I think that is one that probably would have helped strengthen that central thesis, Brad. Unfortunately, we did not talk much about Fincher's direction, but I think we all know David Fincher is a master director known for his technical precision, and that's absolutely the case here. I think that he found a screenwriter here that matched him in technical brilliance for a change. And I think it really does help elevate the script to see how Fincher moves the camera, the way he cuts. Everything seems so intricately planned, and it really helps complement what Sorkin does.
Bob, I feel like you're trying to make up for your Fight Club score here a little bit.
No, this is just a better movie than Fight Club. I'll say that.
Oh, okay. I just feel like you're really heaping on the praise here because you realize how bad of a take your Fight Club score was.
I just wanted to make sure we got a couple nice things in about David Fincher. And if I have to point one thing out, I'll say this. I think that the very end of the film, that last scene, which is Sorkin and Fincher together really creating a great ending, where you just see Zuckerberg sitting in a room alone, friend requesting Erica, and hitting refresh over and over to see if she'll accept. It's the perfect ending to that movie.
And I think on top of that,
the Beatles.
Usually, well, dude, we could talk about the Beatles.
What a great
all day
needle
long.
drop to end that movie with "Baby, You're a Rich Man." It's just such a asshole-ish, cynical thing to do.
But I think one of the things with biopics is that they usually end with the montage pictures of the real person, and it's like, Eduardo went on to make this kind of money and do these things. And, Zuckerberg went on to do these things. This is the first and only time in a movie where I have seen those, title cards or captions used to contrast what's actually happening in the heart of the main character. And I think that is the peak of the importance of this movie, because in the end, the scorecard at the end of the movie, because in the end, that's what it is, right? Like at the end of any biopic, whenever you see those captions, what they're telling you is a scorecard on that human being's life of like, yeah, they went on to be this successful and do these things. And with Mark Zuckerberg, they are putting his scorecard up. Like, he's a billionaire. He's able to pay a $75 million lawsuit to the Winklevoss brothers. He's able to pay an unknown amount to Eduardo. He's able to do all of these things. There's billions of users. And while they're putting up all of these successes, success, what are they showing? An image of him sitting absolutely alone in his lawyer's office where they're letting him sit there for a little while longer using their internet, trying to friend request an old girlfriend.
Absolutely.
That is just some of the most brilliant writing and film direction I've ever seen in my life.
Yeah, it's just such a great touch, and it hits on these two themes.
Bob, that was like a Bob-style rant that I just
I
went
loved
on.
it. And Brad, it really takes us back to these themes that we've identified with the movie. And the first one is this idea of exclusivity. It's everything that drives Zuckerberg forward. He wants to create a world of his own making. I mean, it's something we keep talking about. He wants to kind of be the guy that stands at the door and decides who gets to come in, because he can't get into the final clubs, which is the first thing we establish at the beginning of the movie. And so he wants to make his own. And when the Winklevoss twins approach him with this idea of something that's exclusive, he immediately jumps at it, because now he gets to be the guy who determines who gets in and who doesn't get in. And I think one of the really great things that Fincher does with this movie is that he intercuts like the creation of the face mash thing with this party that's happening at the frat house or at the final club. And what ends up like kind of costing Zuckerberg in the end is this drunken misogynist rant that he went on. But then they're intercutting it with these final clubs and where girls are taking off their clothes and being objectified anyway. And so like what they're trying to say is basically Zuckerberg is doing exactly the same thing as these final clubs do, but we don't like it when Zuckerberg does it because Zuckerberg is a loser or Zuckerberg is a nerd, and we put up with it when these other people do it. It's actually a really, really subtle touch, and I like that they kind of lean into that a little bit. And then the other thing that drives Zuckerberg is revenge, right? Like Erica breaks up with him, so he creates Face Mash as revenge. When he goes and talks to Erica in the restaurant later and talks about making Facebook, and she rejects him again, he says, it's time to expand. Everything he does is this kind of ruthlessness that's targeted towards revenge. And the tragic thing about it is that at the end of the movie, he still can't make a real human connection. No matter how hard he tried to create an empire of his own making, he is still sitting there in that room, clicking refresh, and still can't get into the inner circle. Even though he's the one that's made the inner circle, he is still dependent on Erica letting him in. And so he's just sitting there clicking refresh. It is a brilliant end to the movie. Brad, the more I've talked about this movie, the higher I want my score to be that I give it. But if I'm being honest, I think that this movie does have some flaws. I think that I just really kind of bristle at this idea of it being the movie of the century, quote unquote. It says a lot about who we are. It says a lot about how we communicate. And it's a really good, really solid movie that should have won the Oscar in 2010 and didn't. But for me, I'm going to give it an 8.5 out of 10. I just don't think that it is the game-changing phenomenon that it's been made out to be in retrospect. Still a great movie, absolutely still worth watching, but for me, it's an 8.5 out of 10.
Bob, I think I'm kind of in a similar range of scores as you, but for me, I guess I'm trying to just throw out any semblance of like reality to this film and just saying, how do I like this as a movie? And just simply as a film that I'm looking to entertain me and be interested in, I really love this movie. It's not perfect. There's definitely issues with it. But I'm going to give it a 9 out of 10. You know, like I said, I'm falling in a very similar place as you. It's a great movie with great actors, with great writing, and great film direction. But in the end, I think that as long as you're willing to say, hey, this movie isn't a representation of reality, it's the establishment of an archetype, and it's the establishment of just an interesting foray into what happens when a socially awkward person creates a social media website. I think it really shines. And I will comment for a second. I think it's fascinating that 10 years after The Social Network, which is the idea of bringing people together, we see a documentary come out called The Social Dilemma, pointing out the dangers and flaws of these social networks. For some reason, that little nuance just made me think really hard about this movie, to think about how 10 years after this movie, we're sitting here going, man, should we even be on Facebook?
No, I think it's a great point, Brad. And I also think that we are just building people's watch lists here today. Like, we've mentioned Citizen Kane, we've mentioned The Founder, we've mentioned The Social Dilemma. I think you should go out and watch all those in addition to watching this movie. And on that note, we want to hear what Film and Whiskey Nation has to say about this movie. Do you think The Social Network is the film of the new millennium, or did it kind of pale in comparison to something else, in your opinion? You can reach out to us on Mark Zuckerberg's creation and find us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram at Film Whiskey.
Or you can leave us a voicemail. Let your voice be heard on the Film and Whiskey podcast. Our phone number is 216-800-5923. Once again, it's 216-800-5923. Or if you want to leave us a voicemail on our website, you can find us at www.anchor.fm/filmwhiskey.
Next week, we'll be back talking about Christopher Nolan's 2010 masterpiece, Inception. For the Film and Whiskey podcast, I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And we'll see you next time. Film and Whiskey is produced, engineered, and edited by Bob Book and Brad G. And it's made possible from support from listeners like you. If you'd like to support the show, you can donate directly to us at our Anchor page, anchor.fm/filmwhiskey, where you can support the show for as little as $1 a month. Or if you'd like some perks, donate to our Patreon page. You can find us on patreon.com/filmwhiskey, where for as little as $3 a month, you'll receive benefits like membership to an exclusive Discord chat room, extended cuts of each episode, and early access to every Film and Whiskey episode. We want to say thank you again to our Patreon supporters, especially those sponsoring us at our highest viscosity level, and that includes our friends Corey Easterday, James Talbert, Austin Dupree, and Aperture Flash. We'll see you next week.